All right, thanks for coming, guys. So I'm Kelsey. First of all, we'll introduce our speakers in just a second. I'll be moderating today, but I want to start it out with a couple of stats. Let's get to the good stuff, because we got a jam-packed session here. So, a couple of stats. 80% of an org's tech stack will be made up of SaaS by 2022. Obviously, that varies depending on industry, but across businesses as a whole, that's what we're looking at. And then by 2020, 73% of orgs state that they're going to have nearly all of their tech stack living within SaaS. So that means, let's kind of dig into that a little bit. That, according to some of Intella's data set, actually looks like 14% of that in SaaS spend is routed through your accounting system. That means 84% of spend today is, I don't know, some other places. Expense reports, maybe Concur, some other strange places. Or personal credit cards that are expensed back, maybe. Which is a great place to hide shadow IT that we're going to talk about. So at a 300-person company or more, on average, there's 183 free SaaS apps in use by employees. So that's in addition to the spend stuff we just talked about. Can you imagine if we start to scale up to 1,500, 5,000-person companies, that naturally that follows along? It's kind of terrifying. So, snowball effect, the average 300-person company has 3 times more SaaS than IT is actually aware about, or aware of. So, we're going to talk about how you handle this. I think this is probably the environment that you're all living within if you're here to talk with us today. And we're going to talk through some strategies of how you really deal with that. What's some practical steps and ideas that we've seen work? So, I'm going to introduce our speakers. First, right on my left, is the ever-intelligent Aaron Merchant with Envoy, previously Pixar. And then we've got Barak Kaufman, CEO and co-founder of Intello. It's an intelligent SaaS operations platform that really helps bring visibility to a lot of this stuff. But this isn't a pitch today. We're just going to get right to the meat and the data and some ideas for you guys. So, let's dive right into our questions. I think from the high level, let's kind of start with the picture. I don't want to go too high that it's intangible, but Aaron, when you came in at Envoy, you walked into a new situation like any new person coming into their IT role in a new company would face. So define for us what SaaS Sprawl means to you and what that looked like when you came on at Envoy.
Okay. Well, first off, thank you for having me, and thank you all for being here. Hopefully, I can provide you with a few nuggets of struggle and truth. So, like many of us, I walked in and inherited what was previously in place with the company, which was done at a pace of scale that was right for a company pre-IT, so pre-IT representation within the organization. Most of the folks there were relatively savvy, so they had a really good portfolio that was actually almost to the point that it was a little over-bloated. So that was really how Sprawl got defined for me, and then there was also a natural curiosity, so I have a bunch of people who are very self-sufficient, technologically, have an understanding of what they want to see in their stack and their workflow and how they want the portfolio represented. So that curiosity that comes with that also means that you end up with a good form of shadow IT, even though it still does qualify under that branch. And then there's just all the other stuff that you end up picking up along the way. So that's kind of what I walked into. I was able to leverage that into a bunch of partnerships, which I'm sure we're going to talk about. But I didn't walk into what I would call a traditional shadow IT environment where I was actually fighting a huge battle around trying to both do my discovery and then get reasoning behind the discovery in that process.
Yeah. I mean, we hear that from organizations every day, and I think that problem's even growing more and more as product-led growth is helping
Totally.
in the fantastic UX of products that just make it so easy to gain stickiness and gain users. So the first step with that, which we've talked about before, is often discovery of, I think you've described it as an archaeological dig.
Yep.
Love it. So Barak, this next question's for you. I think it's a foundational premise with SaaS Sprawl is the discovery, and the key to really opening that door is viewing it as an opportunity. It's not solely a problem, right? So your work with CIOs and heads of IT at companies like Epic Games, Segment, Instacart, some of these folks that you've worked with. Where do you see people starting to find that visibility, and what advice do you have during that phase?
Yeah, firstly, thank you everybody for joining today. So the first thing is SaaS sprawl and this kind of like new world of cloud-first applications can be a bit scary, can be a bit intimidating, right? There's more and more decision-making that's decentralized, that's kind of bottoms up. As Kelsey alluded to, we found that 86% of software applications that enter an organization's kind of environment come through expense management tools or kind of the credit cards or sources, even free tools where you don't typically have visibility. But from our perspective and what we've seen working with Aaron as well as many other companies that Kelsey has mentioned is that it's really an opportunity, right? I think this new world of SaaS first organizations and SaaS first adoption creates a massive opportunity for IT. It's created a lot more kind of empowerment and responsibility and accountability for IT to be kind of the experts for these SaaS products. We spend a third of our life working, a third of our life sleeping, a third of our life with friends and loved ones, roughly speaking. Out of that third of our life that we spend working, we're now living in these SaaS products, whether it's Salesforce or DocuSign or Box or Slack. And therefore, IT's role is how do we actually empower that within an organization? How do we allow for somewhat of a decentralized purchasing, but in a compliant and secure way, and use those insights to then make better decisions. And I think that where the opportunity actually comes in is getting that visibility, getting the insights into what are those SaaS applications that employees are signing up for, who's signing up for them, why are they signing up for the 17th, 18th project management software within the company? Why can't they use the 3 that we already have, or the 5 that are compliant, or the 15 that we have, right? So, but there's a reason, right? There's always a reason for why they're adopting it. And I think the more typical approach in the past has been, how do we block that and how do we shut that down? And I think that that's a little bit out of fear, rightfully so, because every new SaaS product gets access to sensitive data. And if that software tool you don't even know is in your environment has a breach, that's kind of all of our, I'm trying to be PG, I'm just gonna say it, asses on the line, right? And that's why it really becomes important to actually know what's happening, talk to those employees, engage them as that adoption's happening. Don't let it spiral out of control before you get the chance. And that's where the opportunity actually comes in as IT leaders to really kind of take control and be an active part in that decision making.
And I think when I've heard you speak about this before, it's some of the first steps at any stage of maturity in terms of where you are and what your priorities are is start with a spreadsheet. If you don't have a spreadsheet already, you should probably start there. But then you can get more sophisticated in building out some sort of automation or workflow to help deal with that. And I think that I'm going to go off script for a second. I know, but
There's a script.
I think that it's super time consuming to obviously manage spreadsheets. Maybe you have one and someone else in the department or someone in another department has their own spreadsheet too. So where do you draw the line of time spent for manual work versus putting the effort into automating that or building some sort of structure, Aaron?
Yeah, well, there's always the challenge of making sure that that content is transparent and available, right? So that was always my intention when I was doing the manual labor and when I was asking other people to do the manual labor as well. The problem with that, right, is exactly what you're leaning into. It's the time consumption, and then what is the scalability that comes along with that, and when do you decide to move into a more robust tool set? What I found is that I would actually lean into a little bit more time spent for the sake of consistent information delivery. The problem with that being that then you start looking at this like very non-complex system that you're using to document all of this and finding out that it's not sufficient for the needs of like how you want to report out of that, how you actually want to make it visible to like external partners. So outside of like my organization or my department, how do I make that equally as visible without it also then potentially having like the too many cooks problem? How do you deal with like just the overall like consistency of the data entry, yada, 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 yada. So, I mean, like, I think there's a point where if you can adopt a tool that takes a lot of the like self-build out of it at the beginning, even though like kind of noodling on the build itself is fun at the beginning, right? Like it gives you the whys and to what you want to metric against. It's probably wiser to do that because you can actually take all that time that you spent developing something from scratch and then actually apply it to a tool that exists out there and then build robustly within the tool. That was definitely something that I learned very early on in starting to build that process, and I'm just really glad that I chose Notion because it was CSV exportable.
Totally. Well, let's take it one step deeper now, because you certainly can't start this manual process with everything. So my follow-up question to that would be, how are you deciding what to care about, and what metrics are you looking at to say, hey, this matters to me that I need to get involved, and or where's the line of, yeah, you keep doing what you're doing?
So we play a push-pull with that line. That's actually one of the ways that we started to look at what was important. I initially walked in and treated everything as important, right? Mostly because it's an opportunity to go shake hands and kiss babies. So if you constantly are like pushing the buttons of everyone around you and going, why are you using this? What is this thing for? What do you do with it? You're the expert. I'm not. I don't know. You tell me. It starts to at least build that cycle of dialogue. And then just like passively taking all of that aggregate information and then dropping it somewhere for us to reference back to later when we decide that we're going to inherit that decision-making process. I've always opted to try and present myself as a partner rather than a gatekeeper, even though it's just a fancy word for gatekeeping. Nouveau riche gatekeeping, partnerships. So, like, but with that in mind, right, like, it makes the idea that they can come to me and also, like, gauge that the questions that I'm asking are going to be in service of them, that, like, we can go through the process of, like, picking and choosing what is actually going to be important, what I can slough back to them as being like, you're not only going to be the responsible party for this, even though you're not necessarily the admin for it. I treat that as a totally separate conversation. And then how we're gonna like work that out budgetarily. A couple conversations that I've had with some other folks that are here this week is like how you identify what those budgetary absorbing tools are for our team. And I just opt to like, is it, I had a fancy word for it when I like walk into my rooms with all my CEOs and my C-suite. But essentially like, do more than 2 or 3 teams use this? If yes, then it's mine.
Yep. So a couple like specifics that I'm hearing here is the need of it broader than the individual?
Right.
Is there broader value that exists today? Who's the ownership that exists today? Individual versus company owned, that then you decide from there.
Totally. I've literally just gotten to the point, because we've gotten probably to like a good place with our archaeological dig, that I've stopped caring about personal use tools. So if somebody can qualify and justify that it is a personal single or maybe 2-person use tool, then I don't give 2 craps about it. Like, you can keep doing what you're doing, and then I'll just readdress that with them either as I see spend increase, or if I start to see more ad hoc adoption, and then we can figure out how we're going to take that on. Yeah. So just kind of calling it the lowest common denominator. I don't want to stop somebody from being able to be extremely efficient, right? Yeah. So fine, try it.
I think that's the right perspective and the theme for what we're talking about today. So Barak, the question for you, in the relationships that you have with some of these other CIOs and heads of IT, how are they defining what they care about in terms of the number of apps? You know more about SaaS and apps than anyone I've ever met. What's the volume that's appropriate for an organization, and how do you figure that out?
This is a very touchy subject, by the way.
Yeah, it's kind of raw.
It's also fun.
Your ass is on the line for the right number here.
So I think Kelsey shared a couple stats at the beginning that really tell a lot of this story, right? One is that 80% of organizations will be majority SaaS by the end of 2020, right? That's as a whole within the market. That's every business has, some will have more SaaS applications, some will have less, maybe based on regulatory needs, maybe based on their digital transformation projects, whatever it might be. But that is a pretty telling stat, combined with the fact that the average 300-person organization has 183 SaaS applications. And that's an incredibly bloated number, right? Like that's there is a lot of redundancies in those 183 applications. There are almost all of them are probably subscription-based with their own renewal information, right? There's 365 days a year, call it 220 working days. You essentially have a renewal every day that you need to manage, right? It's insane. And I think the only kind of solution is what Erin is sharing that she's decided on, which is, one, you need to know, right? You need the visibility. You need to know how many SaaS applications you have. You need to know who's got access to it, what kind of access it has. Because even if it's a individual team or individual user, if that person or that user is your CEO who adds a email tracking tool, and that email tracking tool can read and write all emails, then even though it's free and even though there's one user, it has a lot of sensitive data. And we live now in a kind of compliance data privacy world. And GDPR has kind of already been out there, and CCPA is coming early this coming year. But again, I want to bring it back to like what we've seen with a lot of our customers that we get to partner with is that to them, this isn't, it's not something to be fearful of or scared of. It's actually an opportunity for IT, right? It's an opportunity to take more of that control and take more of that accountability. And starting with manual processes, go have conversations with different departments, try to create a Google Sheet or a Microsoft Excel CSV, or what Erin did with Notion, to be able to start collaborating. And then as that sheet starts to build and you start realizing how quickly it gets dated, that's when it's time to maybe look for a product like Intello that can actually help with it. But really kind of view it as an opportunity to take on that responsibility, to take on that control, to be part of that, the kind of future of like this cloud first adoption, and show the employees that you're not there to be a gatekeeper. You're not there to create more red tape. You're there to help empower them to scale the organization faster, right? And that's really kind of like what we see. So I think a lot of the stats you actually shared, but a lot of the processes and mindset is really, to me, what's most important and what kind of separates a lot of kind of like tech forward modern IT leaders with others. And that's where I think we all should continue to push the industry and kind of recognizing that IT is the most important org within a company, right? The most important department, because you're the experts on those SaaS products that we all live in, that if they go down, no one can actually work.
I'll also add to, like, we talk about this in terms of like being very customer oriented, right? Like there's a bunch of benefits for you to participate in that kind of mindset with like an end user. But when it really comes down to like what we get out of a team place is like, it gives me the opportunity to look at the full suite of what we have in-house, whether or not I'm happy about all of that, and then actually bucket those into priorities, right? Like, so, like the benefit for me and either like building something like that from scratch or using a tool like Intello is that it does actually like give me the ability to prioritize what my response is going to be to certain things and why, right? So I can bucket those into like justifiable use case, and then I, as the representative of that and also wanting to balance the needs of the end user, can then say, like, I can both give tangibles as to what's not, like, what's an absolute hard no, where we can flex on some things, and why we're focusing on a certain, like, subset of app type or SaaS service types. That way, as we are starting to build out, like, a more standardized portfolio of things that I'm going to distribute as, like, core service apps or core services to the entire company, like, they have an understanding of why and what is available, and then where we can actually, like, make some, soft edge choices.
I think you're going to continue to see that employees are actually end up being happy about it. Right?
Totally.
Like having one central project management tool to collaborate on actually benefits the end users and the employees, right? So you'll get some pushback. I know everybody wants their new shiny tool.
Slack versus
Everyone
Teams
wants their new
debate.
shiny tool, but at the same
Never
time, I do believe that with the right partners, as you were saying, creating the right kind of like partners within the organization, the right stakeholders. I know you have your workplace tech team. What we see a lot of companies starting to create is essentially like a SaaS ops SWAT team, right? A SaaS SWAT team, if you will.
Very aggressive.
That's like, yeah, it's an aggressive word, but I've seen it a few times now, and it's basically the IT department partnered with finance, partnered with procurement, if you have a procurement team, partnered with the information security team to be able to make those decisions around how worried should you be, or where do we consolidate, or what are the approved applications, or when and how do we say no?
Totally.
And then getting the buy-in.
Well, it's stakeholdership, right? Like, fancy nouveau-riche word as well. But like getting more buy-in from the right partners around that gives you like a real reason and a real method of communicating about more of that why. Like I'm very big on the why, as a person who always asks why, about why we're doing everything all the time. So like I like to deliver that back both to my team as well as the folks who are going to be interacting with the tool. And I think that's what that really does for you, is be like, you know, we've got 5 different productivity tools. We'll go with that one because it's always like the thing that people want to try first, right? 3 of those are paid, 2 of them are in ad hoc use. We're fine with you continuing to evaluate something. Well, you know, why? Well, because, you know, like it's not actually impacting cross-team work, therefore, go for it. At the point where I start to see that, we're probably gonna have to have a conversation about what like the buy-in trade is for this. Like we're not gonna necessarily drop you down to 4 tools, you can keep your 5, but you get 5. Controversial statement, 5 productivity tools. Here we go.
Crazy, right?
How off script are we now?
No, you're actually right on track. So
Cool.
my next question, what criteria do you use, like what are some specific criteria or data points you're looking for to evaluate the success of one app versus another, if that makes sense? Of what to keep. If something exists that you find out about, do we keep it? Or do we invest deeper, go double down on something? Like, what are the specific KPIs on your dashboard, Aaron?
Well, hopefully I'm not going "Ugh" about it first, because that means that it's probably not going to win to begin with, right? I don't want to find those tools. When I do find those tools, it's probably pretty close, if not like already a hard no. So I tend to, again, drive very like customer forward first, so like my internal customers, but ultimately, right, like there's all the like actual infrastructure that I want underneath. A good analytics panel, does it integrate with my preferred method of auth? Ideally it's SAML versus just SSO, which I find kind of annoying that people seem to have lumped that into one thing when they're not the same. And then how easy is it for me to distribute and provision from that, right? Like all these very like basic fundamentals that come from that. And then outside of that, I'm not really asking a lot of questions. Obviously, like we're a SOC 2 compliant company, so I'm asking those basic security questions. Like we do a little bit of extra ask around like where and how they store their data and what does that look like. But those are all like, I feel like basic technical fundamentals that everybody's asking, because we're trying to get into that place where we are automating a lot of the accessibility to these things. So then I actually return to my partners and I go, okay, you were the last person that touched this tool. Are you my person, like, are you my point of contact in X department? Are you my super user per se, right? Like, are you the person who can at least point me in the right direction to my partner that's going to be able to like rubber stamp this for your team or your department as well? And then why, right? Again, let me see how much of a broken record I can get. Like, why do you want this thing? And then, okay, and then evaluate from there. Within that why, am I hearing the same kind of validation against an existing tool that's already in place? If so, are you ready to trade? And what is that going to look like for your team? And who's going to be the owner of that transition as well? Because I can't support that for you. My team is 2 people. And if the answer to that is we also don't have the cycles to do this, then it's why now, right? So then let's talk about timing and we'll talk about transition and then we'll go back to the vendor and see if they can actually like apply that to us. So I'm really good at like farming out a lot of the conversations about this to other people to make it feel like I'm doing the work.
Jedi mind tricks.
Yeah, and then I make them actually do the labor, and then I do lean a lot on my vendors to actually tell me how it's going to fit into my environment. So I'm perfectly happy with giving them that information ahead of time. Like, I will give you so much extra context that you're going to feel like your family. And then in return, what I want you to do for me is tell me how that's actually going to work and how you're going to support me in that implementation if we're you know, like kind of cringing our way through this actually being successful. And then we usually have like a final conversation before you even get to numbers. So I don't stick with a standard set of questions ever unless they are truly security and compliance based or going to have a direct effect on my team, mostly because like no tool fits all questions. Like, you know, they're never like, not being flexible around the questions that you're asking means that you're probably asking such a rigid, standardized set of questions that you may actually be coming into blind spots as you're evaluating.
Yeah, flexibility.
So, a little more fluid.
Yeah, if I could add to that, or just really echo what you said. So one is, I think that not the final point, but right before that, around kind of using vendors and kind of leaning on them as partners. That's obviously something I could speak to since I work at a SaaS vendor.
Can't confirm.
And I think from our perspective, from like the SaaS vendor perspective, we embrace it, right? We live in a kind of subscription world, right? These SaaS applications tend to be subscription based. You can't build a company without a happy customer base that is retained and growing with you. That's just how the economics of SaaS businesses actually work. If I were in all of your shoes, I'd use that to your advantage, right? Like, and take me up on that, right? If you're an Intello customer or you're interested. But it's like, ask for more. Ask for more than you're seeing. Don't view it as like, hey, this is a product that we're using or someone on our team is using. Say, hey, I need this, this, and this. Or I am concerned about this, this, and this. How can you support me to alleviate those concerns? And if they can't, or if they're not really responding to your request, it's pretty telling, right? For what kind of experience you're going to get and what that's going to look like, regardless of if your team is in charge of supporting this application or it's someone else within the org. So I think that's a great point, and I love that point. Another one is what you said around single sign-on, right? We're definitely seeing a lot more companies embrace single sign-on solutions earlier in their growth and development, right? And organizations that are kind of moving to the cloud, creating a cloud-based identity platform, right? To be able to do that. And one of the obvious use cases is what you're kind of alluding to, which is kind of skim-based provisioning, or just generally like provisioning, onboarding and offboarding for different applications. And as you said, there's a big difference between a SAML integration and
Right.
SSO basic kind of sign-in through the password functionality. One of the unfortunate parts, though, about the single sign-on ecosystem, as many in this room know, is the tax associated, right? The SSO.tax website that I think many of you have actually seen. If you haven't, go to SSO.tax. And it's essentially that a lot of vendors have used that as an opportunity to charge more, to say, hey, if you want extra security, or what they view as like extra security, you have to pay more for that. And that's unfortunate, and that needs to change. And I think that the only way that changes is, again, connecting those two different points of like leaning on your vendors and telling them like, hey, you can't charge me 3,000% more for single sign-on, for a SAML-based integration. Like, we just won't go with you. There are other SaaS solutions that we can use. And I'm going to have to go to our team and say, I'm really sorry, but we can't support this because they're not providing it. And I just think as an IT community, there's power in numbers. And if we start to say, right, like in this world, that this is not acceptable, you can't just view this as like, oh, we're enterprise because we want single sign-on, so you got to pay more. If you say, no, this is like charging us to set a password, then eventually, it might not happen overnight, and it might not happen every one of those conversations, but eventually these SaaS vendors will not charge more for SAML-based connections, and it will change like how we're able to manage these applications and support applications and best-of-breed approach.
Well, I mean, when it really comes down to the tangible aspect of that, because that's like the very heady philosophy that like it's a right, not an add-on, is that like when you're talking about like, say you've bought into a tool and you're trying to drive adoption, like I don't understand why you wouldn't think about that or evaluate against it, right? Because if I'm thinking about like ease of use and ease of accessibility, the first thing I want is like I want a seamless provisioning process. So if I'm looking at that against like what's actually available to me via like like the skim provisioning of the service, like if it doesn't have that, it means that I have to do more labor to distribute this tool to a larger swath of users, and or I have to get stakeholders who maybe don't have a full understanding of the administrative rights and privileges within that service itself, and then how much of that uncomfortable control do I want to share or give up or trade for the efficiency of my own time and my team's time as well, right? So, I mean, that's a huge thing that I always ask, like, if I'm talking about, like, those infrastructure fundamental questions.
This is a great theme on, I'm just going to put a bow on it, as decentralization.
Yep.
Is what it feels like.
Yep.
We've started to drive a little bit into, like, active versus inactive usage as well, and I want to make sure we cover that, too. So how do you define the percentage of inactivity versus activity that is acceptable within a SaaS app, for example?
Oh, God. The struggle is real.
Pick a number, Erin.
I do it more by time than by adoption. I honestly don't have much of I try not to care. As long as the total user count or total license count is not completely out of skew or out of scope with the actual active usage. Great example of that, right? Like I've got like somebody paid for 150 license count of one of my SaaS applications, and I have like under like a quarter of that is actually active usage. So that's something that like I just need to reevaluate. Like somebody, no offense to the people who came before me, but somebody made a bad decision. But like that is not the norm. So if I'm looking at like, you know, a per user increase or a per user decrease, something that's got a little bit of flex, what I really want to see is consistent use over a duration of time. I've started to, I gave them like, I started with 6 months because I really wanted to like aggregate all that as I was trying to figure out who was actually using what. And then I've like narrowed that down to about a 60-day window. So if I'm starting to see big fluctuations in usage at like within a span of 60 days, then it's probably time to reevaluate, or I at least need to check in with that partner who has an understanding of the why behind that, right? Like, is it just, did we just quarter close and now we're seeing everybody go on vacation, right? Like, is this just like inactivity because it's not the right, it's just like not something that we interact with, but when we do, it's in boom, or are people dissatisfied? Is there something that we're not providing? So it's also a good pulse check of doing like all the things that you need to do to make or keep your department relatively popular, or at least like decently liked. Just be like, did we screw something up?
So
I'm
C
just
plus
checking in.
is-
C plus or higher. Like
Good.
we'll start with C, right? And then we can get some wins in there afterwards.
Yeah. So I have 2 more questions, and then I do want to make sure we have like 5 minutes for Q&A if anybody has questions. But the example you gave earlier about the CEO who may or may not have given permissions to his entire world, to Facebook, Twitter, all of those kinds of things.
Not self-referential,
So let's
is
ask
it?
the CEO,
No, not me.
so that everybody can take notes. What exactly, word for word, should someone say to the CEO to help lock that down? No
Wow.
pressure.
I don't know what to say word for word. I think it is situation dependent. So I don't want to give you a script.
That's
because
bad.
I don't think.
Really tangible.
I don't think. Yeah, exactly. I think that they will know that it's bad when it's brought to light. And if as soon as you go have that conversation with the CEO or whoever it is, whether senior in the org or not, and you let them know that, hey, I think this is a problem, inherently what they're going to be saying is like, oh shit, they found out about that.
Yeah.
Right? Like, and if you're finding out about, if you're going and then having that conversation and saying like, hey, do you know that you have all your data here? Or do you know that you have this email tracking tool that can read every single email on your behalf? Or do you know that you added this Slack bot that can read and write all of our Slack messages within our Slack environment? I hope that any kind of any responsible employee or responsible colleague will recognize why that is a problem. I actually don't think that you have to make too hard of a pitch, but you need to know, you need to be armed with the data to make that fact. Because if it's an emotional argument, like you shouldn't do this or you shouldn't do that,
Right.
It's very easy to push back. If you come with data, it's like, whether it's about activity and inactivity, right? Like, hey, you've set up this email, let's take the email tracking tool. You set up that email tracking tool 6 months ago. I'm not seeing any activity for this tool. It's got these permissions. Do you still need access to this? How are you using this? Right? And instead of turning it into a combative kind of questioning, you got to just bring the facts to light. And as you bring those facts to light, I think it becomes obvious, again, to any responsible member within an organization, CEO or not, why that's important and puts everyone at risk.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's always like approaching all of those things with the assumption that there was not malintent is always a wise place to be, even though we may not like internally feel that. Like we're probably somewhere deep down inside full of rage. But, right, like you want to assume best intent with everyone around you. So
Balance
approaching
is healthy.
Right? Yeah. A little bit of that, like yin and yang. But what that really also means is that, like, what I'm hearing from you is like it's either you usually get two forms of a response. Oh my God, I didn't know, or
I know, which is like that admission of guilt. like we know you knew. And then doing exactly what you're doing is actually laying out the facts of like what we're seeing, like what that actually means, and making it tangible. That's really the key, right? Like the email tracking one is a really like good example of that, because you're talking about like serious permissions. You'd be like, are you comfortable with this other free application literally having purview into what is your digital diary? Probably not. How do you feel about that now that I've said that? Can I take it back? Right? Like, and I don't actually think, like, I know we were talking specifically in the context of C-suite. I don't actually think that there's a requirement unless you are like, like everyone knows their C-suite the best. I usually run with the philosophy that like you should approach them with the same amount of information and relationship as you do everyone else in your company, because they are actually, right, like your best partners in terms of like top-down drivers of philosophy change around that, right? Like, so if you're encouraging them to model the behavior in the same way that you also expect that of your users, then you're probably going to get a nice, like, cyclical relationship from them. Also, I think part of that, like the problem that we've run into just over time is as we've coddled them because we want their time to be spent in the best place and in the best way, is that they are no longer totally in tune with the tool sets that are in place, and bringing them back into that conversation is super important. So you're going to get chastised for me, like in no matter where you are in the vertical or horizontal chain.
So
Brace yourself.
I want to end with just enough time for questions, but to put a bow on all of these thoughts discussed, let's talk a little bit about strategic goals. That's something that is super hot right now in terms of the year.
Strategic
Goals.
So hot right now.
So hot. What was the Nouveau
Riche.
There it is, 3 times. I think that's a record too on stage.
Does Beetlejuice appear now? Since I said it 3 times.
So what kind of measurable goals, Aaron, do you set for 2019, or did you set, and what are your new goals going to be for 2020?
I admittedly totally miscalculated my goal this year. So we came
Never happened before.
Never in the history of my life have I failed. This is just a misstep. So I came in and like speaking to the numbers about how many tools, and I'll talk about specifically like SaaS related, with an incredible swath of tools. It was actually more like 300 when I started, so my portfolio was freaking massive. It naturally reduced, which was great. And then I looked at that and I looked around at a, like budding hockey stick growth stage startup and said, like, how can I actually like pre-prove our value and worth and how we're thinking about things? And I set a number goal, so an actual like financial number goal. And I said, we're going to try and reduce our SaaS spend by $100,000. For this quarter, which really has turned into a year-long process, which is one of the reasons why it was a bit of a misstep. I also don't think that it was the right metric, ultimately. What I should have probably been doing is, rather than say that like the reduction in number was the most important part, is like what is actually the objective around that number. Like, and I needed to step back about 3/4 of the way through and kind of like rewrite that OKR essentially to say, that the strategy that we want to embody is that we want people to be more cognizant from all 3 of the pillars, right? The efficiency, the security, and the financial standpoint, and then how can I reach that goal? So I'm actually in the process of rebuilding that strategic process right now. The first part of that being, I'm going to have an applicable department, team point of contact, and or individual, and an understanding of what the tool is doing for each one of those places. And once I get that, then I'm going to actually be able to evaluate that against the dollar amount. So I don't have questions right now because I completely blew them up. But I'm expecting that I'm going to probably build that into how like more of the decentralization is going to be for 2020. So then how can I take everything that I've learned in this partnership that I have built with the entire organization and apply that to being able to decentralize the responsibility away from my team outside of the actual provisioning, unless they need an escalation point. Because I'm hoping that I can get to a point of trust with folks that they do understand like coming to us, when to come to us, and how to come to us, and that will be the way that I can get back all my other project cycles.
It's a year of power moves. What about you, Brock? What are you hearing from people for 2020
Sounds like you're going to
goals?
crush 2020. I think Erin articulated that really well, and I want to leave time for questions too. But one thing that I've seen more recently for a lot of IT leaders is a shadow IT reduction kind of goal. Basically saying we want visibility into 90% of our application footprint. And that percentage number will differ depending on the organization. There's one in particular that I could think of that said they wanted 100% visibility, zero shadow IT, every approved application, which I don't think is possible. So again, set realistic goals and thoughtful goals and figure out, what is the benchmark, what is your starting point, whether that's 300 applications, 100 or 10. And then figure out maybe the goal isn't shadow IT reduction. Maybe it's for your organization adopting more SaaS applications or moving from a few install-based applications towards the cloud version of it, right? So every organization, depending on their kind of industry and needs and existing tech stack, will have different goals. Another one last trend that I'll kind of mention relates to that compliance, GDPR and CCPA and all these new the alphabet soup of compliance regulation that seems to be popping up. That actually again really creates an opportunity for IT to create goals that actually align with the business goals and objectives, where it's now a need to have to be compliant with these regulations. And one of those steps is actually managing all your sub-processors and vendors and making sure that they are secure compliant. And again, if you're in a healthcare organization and dealing with HIPAA, or your organization is going through FedRAMP, every organization is different. But figure out what within that regulation relates to my team's objectives and IT's objectives. And I think that there's, again, a really big opportunity to hopefully get a huge raise in 2020, because the other departments have recognized what an important role IT has played in getting these compliance regulations and setting those goals, not just within isolation of your team, but thinking about the business as a whole.
I take the head count over a raise.
Headcount over raise. More people on the team.
Honestly.
Team
Very
player.
democratic.
Team player.
Yeah. Cool. All right. Well, do we have any questions from anybody?
Thank you all for coming out.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
Great.
This is more for Aaron. Do you have like a blog or anything that has to do with?
Do you have a YouTube?
Oh, cool. Hi, this is a microphone. That's apparently. Oh God.
Hey.
Jesus.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi.
Weird, huh?
Yes. Aaron, do you have like a blog about any of these things that you're doing and the initiatives and the way that you're doing these workflows? Because I sorely need this.
No, I hadn't actually thought about that. I mostly go around and do this, and I say them verbally, and I'm like, wow, that sounded really smart, and I'll never remember that I said that ever again. I'm always happy to correspond via email. I'm also on Mac Admins too, so I do a lot of my general knowledge share there. But I will definitely take that into consideration. I also think that it's something Envoy has a pretty good blog presence in general, so it's something that I can bring back as should be part of our larger brand presence. Happy to do that for you. Thank you for reminding me that this is a thing that I should be doing.
I'd
Damn
subscribe
it!
to that.
Now I have more work.
That sounds awesome.
If Envoy has that brand marketing blog,
Yes.
you probably just talk to somebody on that team.
Yeah, totally.
They would
and they can
love
write
it as a
for me.
marketer.
Yes.
Yeah.
I totally, yeah. No, I thank you for the recommendation. I'm happy to bring that back to our team and our marketing team. They love things like this, especially knowing that, not to plug my own, pay my salary, but this is something that they're thinking about, especially going into 2020. I'll just put that out there, is there's a huge push internally from my organization to have a better understanding of what we do as IT professionals and how we assess tools. So the more kind of communication that we can do in this nature, they are just nom, 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 eating up right now, and I'm happy to be the facilitator for that.
Not that I'm sure many of you are in Mac admins, and hopefully many of you are on Slack. We also have our own Slack group, and basically the idea behind it was not to create kind of Slack channel sprawl proliferation, but actually to create kind of a dialogue around these kind of things. So hopefully we if you want me to personally connect you with maybe other IT leaders that you can share notes for that are kind of dealing with these like SaaS first problems, I'm happy to in that Slack group. You can join from our website, Intello.io. You can chat with Erin there; she's on it, but you can also direct message her and Mac admins, of course.
Yeah. And if anyone wants to bring their business card or something up, or just tell me your name, then we can just send you an invite to it too.
I'm merchant on Mac Admin Slack, by the way, so you can find me.
Cool.
Any other question there?
Questions?
Are you gonna heckle me?
Oh, don't throw that. Yeah.
No, I don't think I can.
What's up?
No, so I had a question. You had mentioned basically earlier that when you review SaaS stuff, you make a decision. Am I going to manage it, or am I going to just kind of ignore it, to paraphrase?
Yeah.
What if corporate tells you you have to roll everything up into one instance, but you have two groups using, let's say, Jimmy's awesome app? They don't play well together in the sandbox. How do you approach that, talk to them, charm them?
So I'm hearing a couple of things there. One is that, right, like you have a mandate that requires you to be the ultimate, like both manager as well as administrative body for all of your tools. Okay. And then the second part of that is like you have multiple different teams who have an investment in that tool but use it completely differently. Am I understanding that right?
Yes.
Cool. So at that point, I would probably start assessing how large those teams are and or those departments are and what their impact is in that tool. And those are the ones that I might absorb as being like the master controller. If the tool itself has the ability to build two different sandboxes, that's probably the wisest way that I'd initially approach it, though obviously there's still, like, you're not necessarily setting yourself up for good collaboration if that's also a requirement either between those two teams or departments or outside of that, right? Like, are they passively sharing? Are they, you know, like for viewership or whatever it is that they're doing? Also, I think that there is an argument to be made of like neither of you can have your cake and eat it too. Like we're gonna find a way to provide either like sectioned out, right? Like this is all assuming that we live like all of these tools are perfect and robust and customizable. But like, can we build out a sandbox where both of you can play nicely, even if you're not necessarily going to play with all of the buttons? And then see if that's a good solution. If it's literally like an actual like, and then there's also the question to be asked of like, is it actually right for you all to be living in the same tool? Do you have to? I will say I'm becoming much more subscribed to allowing people to have flex within the tools as long as you can actually share and collaborate. I think it's a great learning experience for people, right? Like it gives them an opportunity to further education and become familiarized with a broader tool set, which, total side note, is really good for your career development and growth because it means no matter where you go, you're probably familiar with at least like 50% of somebody's existing workflow. Lost my train of thought, but I think I'm just going to end it there.
Thanks.
Does that help?
Yes.
Okay, cool.
Cool. Any other questions?
I think it's lunchtime.
Awesome. We will not keep you from brisket, I think.
Thanks for coming out.
Today.
We have, if anybody wants to learn more about Intello or us, the website is intello.io. My email is Barak, B-A-R-A-K, @intello.io. We also have a booth out there, and we'll be here through tomorrow.
I also
Enjoy
posted this in Mac
the snow.
Admins. We have so much cold brew at our booth.
True.
Please. We've
you
gone
need
through one
caffeine.
of 6 boxes. So please, if you like coffee, we have lots.
Well,
Thanks for
thank
coming
you,
out.
Kelsey, Aaron, and
Thanks,
Brock.
y'all.
Thank you so much. Yeah, a round of applause.
Thank you.